to know the truth. What happens next is all up to you. It is up to you to know the deal. And the truth is, you know that it's real. Let your heart decide to know the truth. Maybe then that's all you'll have to do. Know that it's real. Let your heart decide to know the truth. Maybe then that's all you'll have to do. And
Yeah, thank you all again. This is session number 3 for Healing Sound of the People. Thanks again to Ropeadope for hosting this. Today is I really think that it's a sign on how heavy this topic is, because 3/4 of the guests that were going to join are not here. One of them, I am literally in the midst of texting, and she's just feeling very sick, and is literally in bed. And I was like, "You're more than welcome to join." And she's like, "I'll try, but no promises." The second person is in the hospital for surgery. And the third is having a family member who's in the hospital, who they said that their family member is being released today. So it's just, there is a part of me that actually processes that this is how disturbing this topic is. That being said, the guest we have today is Kirsten Dyke. Sorry, how do I pronounce your name? I need to get it right.
Kirsten Dick, but don't worry.
Yes, Kirsten Dick. And I wanted to invite Kirsten on today for the discussion point, because today's topic is about fascism and music. And there are a lot of reasons I want to cover this, just in regards to, there are a lot of fascinations with fascism. That's the surface level understanding, but in reality is that it is the term I've heard is a socially transmitted disease, and it is a very destructive sociological phenomenon. And one thing within the work of activism and within the work of the healing arts is that we have to be fine-tuned on how to acknowledge and discover fascism when it rears its head. I'm gonna kind of summarize this. We're gonna get way more into it after we begin discussing. But just my final thought before I guess we play the first video is that fascism is not only the neo-Nazi stereotype that we have. That is a form of fascism, but we have to remember that I believe it was Eli Mosley, and then there was Franco from Spain, and there was Pinochet in Chile, and there are just many different forms of fascism. And there's a really great book by the late incarcerated philosopher George Jackson called Blood in My Eye that I really highly recommend everybody to read because it really does a great job of deciphering fascism as a process as opposed to a destination. And I guess Kirsten, did you want to say anything before we play our first video, just to say what's up?
Yeah, sure. So I've done a bunch of research on like white power and neo-Nazi music, but also like music in the Holocaust. And I worked while I was doing my doctoral research, I also worked with a research group at the University of Göttingen through the generous funding of the Fulbright Commission. That was focused on music, conflict, and the state. So I had other, graduate students and postdocs around me who are researching things like music that was used by the Greek junta in the 1970s, like in their prisons and stuff. My supervisor was actually researching drummer boys in the like 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. That was in, the US Civil War, as well as a lot in, European armies. They, would use like pipes and drums, and they tended to be little kids often to send the signals for marching, and different military commands would be transmitted through music. So there's a whole lot that people haven't necessarily thought of in terms of ways that music can be used actually for harm, right? So that's more what I've focused on rather than the lovey-dovey music therapy, which is a lot more fun, but it's only half of the coin.
Yeah, and with that, Lewis, if you could put up the first video, which is the partisan. Yeah, cool. Yeah, yeah, we can get into that. So before we get into the real dialogue here, that song is called "The Partisan," which is an anti-fascist anthem that was from the French Resistance in World War II. It was composed in 1943 by a composer who was Russian-born, Anna Marley. And the original title was La Complainte du Partisan, which is the Lament of the Partisan, but it's really turned into it's really known as The Partisan. And even though the original song is very much in line with the French chanson tradition, the chord progression that I was taking from was actually from the Leonard Cohen version, which was on his 1969 album Songs from a Room. And the song itself is about fascist resistance, and like one of the lyrics, for instance, it's speaking about how they wish they could resign themselves from taking battle, but it says, but I could not, and I took my weapon. And so it's a really powerful song, and it's been used as part of anti-fascism for a very long time. And the last thing I want to say before we really begin this entire dialogue is I'll just give my personal definition of fascism, though this is not an academic this is not an academic understanding, but this is just to the way that I kind of use to process my own mental space when calibrating. And the way that I define fascism is a radical form of traditionalism with a heavy emphasis on a mythological past and a return to a mythological past, as well as a clearly defined yet abstract enemy. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot of debate. Robert Paxton wrote, a really thorough definition in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, as well as Mbeko Erto, his essay called Fascism, I think, is a really good understanding. And I had already mentioned George Jackson's Blood in My Eye. But with all that being said, Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to ask you, how do you define fascism?
I think you hit a lot of the key points of it. I think also, a heavy emphasis on like authoritarianism is a big one. But it really is that idea that in the past we were better and right now is terrible, and if you just stick with us, we'll return to that in some sort of a glorious return in the future that quite often doesn't seem to materialize once they actually get into power. But I guess that depends on your definition of glory and uh, happiness as well, right? So yeah, that's really the key aspect of that. Although there are plenty of non-fascist traditions that also have that idea of we need to get back to something from the past that we've lost.
Yeah, it's so the reason I wanted to cover this topic is so first and foremost, to be very frank, and I think it's important to be frank, uh, with the rise of Donald Trump, I had a big realization that had I been 10 years younger and was same political literacy, that I had when I was in my teens versus my 20s. Though I don't know how old I was when Trump came into power. Now that I'm thinking about it, but I think I was in my 30s. But the point is, I would have been in my late teens, early 20s, and um, am absolutely susceptible to the draw of fascism, and it was one of those things where I had been so conscious at that point of the ability to fall into these movements on sort of an intellectual level, but to really see people in my community and even members of my family become susceptible to this process of seeing the world was very very shocking in a lot of ways. And so right around that time I was really really focused on entering into fascist spaces online and engaging with them, because it was almost a personal mission. And the way just to describe it, and I know this is very self-centered, this episode is weirdly personal compared to some of the other ones, but the way that I kind of describe it, because I've had people talk about anti-fascist work in a holistic manner, and it's like, what the fuck is the point of that? Like, these people are horrible. Like, there's so many things to put your energy towards. And the way that I have processed it is that if it comes down to legitimate civil conflict, I know which side I'm standing on. I know what I'm standing, where I stand. I know these these pieces, but I also understand that it is just so much more complicated that somebody can fall into these spaces. I had a lot of friends from the military who fell down the QAnon rabbit hole, and they're just, you can't even communicate with them anymore. I had literally a guy that I served with and was so tight with, just within a matter of 3 weeks of him falling down the hole, we don't speak anymore. And he was he was a deep friend, and it's just it was really traumatizing. And so Kirsten, for those of you that don't know, wrote a book called Reichrock. And one I read the book. Actually I don't have it with me. It's in my nightstand. But she wrote a book that is just a deep dive into the white power music scene. And for an anti-fascist activist who is specifically engaged in music as a resource and a power, this book was just essential in understanding the complexities and the networks that go into this. And so I wanted to just thank you, Kirsten, for doing the work that you've done, because it really it's an essential resource, I think, for anybody who wants to engage in this work. So yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to ask if you could give a little bit of insight into how you got into the writing the book, what kind of research you did, maybe even just describe white power music to somebody who is not familiar with that. And I'll leave it to you, Flores.
Sure. So to answer the last question first, white power is really amorphous, really hard to describe, but I generally would throw in there people who would define themselves as racist. So we're not talking about people who would like argue back with you and tell you that they're not racist, even though you clearly know they are. Like, I was working with people who would say, when you said like you're a racist, they would say, yes, I am. That was the kind of music that I was looking at, like music that was actively made with the goal of advancing this racist agenda. Some of the music was really overtly racist. Some of it was quite veiled with like using a lot of layers of metaphor to kind of cover the fact that it was advancing this racist agenda, but all of it was with the goal of advancing this actively, you know, racist agenda, and that was the point. I actually, so I this came about, I guess it would have been about 2007. I was doing my master's degree in ethnomusicology, and I was fishing around for a master's thesis topic. I'd wanted to write on country music, which is also fascinating, but everything that I wanted to say, as it turned out, had already been written by people who knew a lot more about country music than I did. And I was poking around the university library and found this book that happened to mention that there were a couple of record labels, mostly in Louisiana in the 60s, that had put out a bunch of hate country music affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan that had gotten sold at county fairs and stuff like that, played on some local radios, played on some local jukeboxes. And there were like 2 or 3 sentences in this whole book about that. And I thought, like, that's a giant thing to just kind of throw away. And I'd seen American History X, and I was kind of aware of the fact, growing up in the 90s, just peripherally aware of the fact that, racist people made this rock music, because that was like the golden age, if you can call it that, of neo-Nazi rock music, was exactly when I was a teenager. Um, and I couldn't find very much written about it. A couple of book chapters at that point in 2007, and that was it. And there's a lot more now than when I first started. But I kind of thought, okay, if there's nothing written about this, we'll go for it. So that was how I got into it. And once I'd done the master's thesis, you talk about going down rabbit holes. I did the master's thesis and then thought, okay, let's do the doctoral dissertation on this. And after the doctoral dissertation, well, you might as well write a book. And I kind of figured that as I was writing the book, it was something that I would do as a career move. And you publish these academic books that are, read by like, 3 people in the Harvard library ever, and that's it. And it's always just a wonderful surprise to find out that anyone actually did read it and buy it and find it interesting. So I'm really flattered to be asked. It's always just kind of a surprise, actually. But it also is, I think, an important topic, because right as I was getting the first off the press copies of the book in my hands, that was actually the same week as Trump got elected, which is a bit sobering. Like I'd been saying all through grad school, this could happen here. It's not that far away. And everybody said, you're crazy. And as it turned out, I might be crazy, but not because of that.
Yeah. It's just, there's, like all social analysis, it's really important to understand the best you can any kind of topic. And one thing, I'm gonna just be very upfront with you. Your book is one of the few books I had to read a little bit and then stop and like set it down, because just processing how far gone some of these folks had gotten was just because I'm really an empathetic person, and it was just like it's like watching just this mental disease deteriorate these people, but then also just I don't know. I guess the reason I wanted to talk to you specifically is music gets overlooked a lot in indoctrination processes. Like right now, I'm going through a big cult phase, just kind of understanding the concepts of cults. And it's like as you dig deeper, fascism is very cult-like. It's, you know, a lot of people sort of assume that cult is a religious phenomenon, but there are political cults, there are psychotherapy cults, there are multi-level marketing cults, and so like neo-Nazism is very much a cult. And um one thing that I've just noticed, like even with like Nexium or Scientology, there's a lot of use of music. Like Keith Raniere of Nexium, the cult leader, he was a pianist. He's a concert pianist, and they had they have a choir. Like Nexium has a choir, and that was a huge thing. But also like Scientology. I mean, one of our people in the jazz world, Chick Corea, was a devout Scientologist, and it actually burned a lot of bridges because of his behavior from where he was coming from. But the reason I wanted to have you on is so often when I talk to somebody who is indoctrinated into these spaces, music ends up being one of the pathways that got them there. Uh, there in the 80s, for instance, or the 90s, it was a lot of people going to punk shows. And I mean, Nazis being in punk scenes was such a problem that NoFX literally had to write a song called Nazi Punks Fuck Off to encourage their audience to physically remove Nazis from concert spaces. But it gets even in the current day, there's an entire subgenre called fash wave. It's electronic dance music, and a lot of these alt right kids, they're incel types. They're on the computer all day. They're listening to this internet music, and it starts off listening to cringe music for like the meme or the laugh of it, or it's offensive for offensive sake. But it's almost it requires a certain amount of awareness before opening that door that a lot of young people are not equipped to deal with, and they end up basically having parts of their identity chipped away, and end up becoming further and further indoctrinated into these groups. And so what is like some of the insight on just some of the people that you did speak to that are involved in these movements, and their process on what music was for them within the movement, or is for them within these movements?
Okay, well, one of the major limitations of my book, I should say up front, is that I did not do a lot of field work for it. So I have, like, I did a lot of poking around on web forums and reading what people had to say. And I didn't interact as much with people, like one-on-one, who were involved in the music. And if I were to venture back into this to do another book, that probably would be where I would go now. Would be toward actually like talking to people, interviewing people. I have presented at least one conference with Christian Picciolini, who has written a bunch of books about exiting um, neo-Nazi movements. He was involved, especially in the 90s. I would say probably about the same age as me, late 30s, early 40s, and got super involved to the point where like he was in a white power band. He was running a record label that was selling white power albums under the counter. But a lot of what people have said and published and talked publicly about is that it is kind of often a self-esteem issue, that these movements are replacing a sense of self-confidence or self-esteem that for whatever reason is missing somewhere else in your life. giving you something to grab onto that says, no, you are valuable, you are important, you are worthwhile, because you're white, or because you believe in our religion, or because you're doing these rituals, or whatever it is that the movement wants you to do. That often it is people who, for whatever reason, are kind of struggling. And one of the things that we've seen really with the Trump movement, like, people tend to get, for whatever reason, I've never really been sure about it. People tend to get really worked up about the youth, like, oh, the youth are in danger. But what we've seen with the Trump movement is it's not just the youth. Actually, it's our elders, who have often gone down the Fox News rabbit hole, the QAnon rabbit hole, and jobs disappearing from the Rust Belt. Um, Often it's white men feeling like their position in society is eroded every time somebody else gains a little bit of, civil rights, or gains a little bit socioeconomically, feeling like you can't just walk into wealth and privilege anymore. And it doesn't even necessarily require that you actually lose anything, just the perception that you're losing something, um, is enough to make a lot of people feel angry and reach out for communities of other people who are angry. So I guess that's why a lot of people tend to join these movements, but our brains really like to be with groups of other people, believing what other people believe. That's what we were evolved to do, is to operate, really in groups of about 150 people. And when we were hunter-gatherers operating in, groups of 150 or less, wandering around, it probably was beneficial for survival to, anytime you saw somebody who looked different or was unfamiliar, to be automatically suspicious. So our brains are really good at doing that. And then when you transfer us into these giant cities of millions of people from all over the globe, that particular brain function doesn't adapt so well always to having to be around people and cooperate with people who don't talk or think or look like you.
Yeah, there's I'm gonna put a couple of stories out there, just on the complexities of this matter. The first one is one of my mentors in the music therapy profession was speaking about working in an in a carceral setting, and it was a detention center for young people. And for anybody who follows my work knows that in carceral settings we use hip hop, like really violent hip hop, a lot of times. And uh yeah, like there's of course the discussion on like what is the use of violence in music. And the music therapy perspective is it's not our call to make that choice. These are true stories. They're, whether they are literally true or emotionally true, they're true, and they're telling a truth. And so my mentor was doing a group where they were listening to hip hop music every week. People would bring in different songs, and there was this one white boy in the group who asked if he could share a song the following week. And my mentor was like, yeah, sure, totally. And he was like, what song is it? And it ended up being a song by Screwdriver, who's a really infamous neo-Nazi band. And my mentor was basically like, oh, and he had to literally process through, like, all right, how do I tell this kid, after we've listened to weeks of hip hop music with extreme violence in it, how do I tell him that I don't think we should do this song? I don't think you can play this song in this group. And there's a couple of reasons why. Part of it was a practical manner. it was, if you play this song in here, I don't know what could happen to you. If you're like, when we're out of the group, like, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, this is going to enrage a lot of people. But then there's the deeper thing, which is, I mean, this is the nature of white supremacy. It's oftentimes you hear white folks be like, why can't I talk about this thing? And it's not a matter of you can or cannot speak on a subject. It's that you already have these benefits that you don't even have to go through this processing mechanism that other people are going through. And by you forcing yourself into the circumstance, you're actually causing a ripple effect that just keeps social blocks going on. And it just it's a complicated thing. And so the whole point was that this music is far more destructive than any of the hip hop music that we're listening to, just in regards to a social fabric. And so what my mentor ended up doing was he put out the groundwork that it was like, I don't know if it's the safest thing to play this song. How about we do a session, just the two of us, and we do this music? And so they did a private music therapy session with this song, and it was a lyric analysis, and they used it as a resource for breaking down the content and breaking down what this song meant. And as they got through the session, it started to become more clear that this 14-year-old kid, I made that number up, it might have been 15 or 16, but this teenager had a father who was incarcerated for a hate crime. And this was the music that his father listens to. And it actually had way more to do with trying to connect somehow with his father and his father's being or energy than it had to do with the actual content. And who knows? I don't know the details of like what went on further after that session. This is just an anecdote that our professor literally told us once, just to talk about the complexities of how challenging this can be. The second anecdote that I want to just put out there is I had at Rikers Island, I had a woman that I was working with who, she had a swastika on her forehead. She had all the tattoos and everything. And she was in the mental health unit, and just saying horrible things to all of the Black women officers that were around. Just all this nasty, nasty stuff. As many slurs as you could think of, just all this social stuff. Like, one of them was like, the difference with white women and Black women is that white women keep their babies and Black women don't. It's just strange stuff. But I came up and I'm just like listening, because I was literally either the only or one of like two or three white people. I think I was the only white person in the space at this particular moment. But I came up and just listened. And just one bragging moment. I did have a moment that I was super proud of in regards to just like making a good zinger, because everybody laughed really hard. But she said something about, I'm a white lives activist, and I'm like, all right, like, I'm white, like, what are we fighting for? And literally all the guards started like laughing really hard, and I got a lot of brownie points for that comeback. It was weirdly good. But anyways, all of this to get to that, when this woman finally started to calm down, it's like I gave her the space to just say the horrible stuff she had to say. And she starts to calm down, and it's like music therapist perspective. You come in with like, all right, well, what kind of music do you listen to? And she was like, oh, I love Mary J. Blige and Lauren Hill. And it's just like my head exploded, because it was like, you realize those are Black women. And she goes, oh, but they're different. And which is just the, like, this is such a bizarre story. It's like something you can't make up. It's like it's like I don't even know how to explain how weird this experience was, but it was such an indicator on how complex people can be. It's like you can be a literal neo-Nazi and still not see the contradiction in your views with the music that you listen to. And it ended up, there was a lot that ended up happening with that woman. But her response was she was a victim of really serious sexual assault. And I don't want anybody listening to this to perceive this as excuse making. We hold everybody accountable who we work with in the carceral system, if no matter what your conditions that brought you there is. But it also, there are always explanations to things. It's not just somebody's born a certain way. There are always explanations. So I'm curious if you have any reactions to either of those anecdotes.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point, that sometimes the response is like, these are just bad people. Why are you dealing with them? And that's not actually true. And when you think about it, I think most of us have those kinds of contradictions going on in us. Like, we know that the planet is warming, and yet we take the long shower and we run the air conditioning, and we're able to hold that contradiction in our heads. Or we know that we're polluting the planet, and yet we buy the stuff with all the packaging and throw it away, knowing that it's probably going to end up like inside a sea turtle or something. And people could and probably will, frankly, in 50 years look back at us like, how could you do that? The same way that we're looking at this woman on Rikers Island, like, how could you listen to Black female hip hop artists and yet also yell at all the Black women around you that they don't keep their children, which is, you don't know those people. You have no idea if they kept their children or if they even have children. But yeah, when you start to talk to people, yeah, it's a lot more complicated than that. And if you come at somebody with fact and with logic, oftentimes it doesn't penetrate, right? That you have to kind of step back and you have to address the emotions, and you have to do it in a space where the person feels pretty safe before they'll start letting down their guard. And oftentimes it takes years to deprogram. It's not something that can happen just in the space of a 5-minute conversation, which is why I know a lot of people who just go online, Reddit or Facebook or whatever, and just punching off zingy one-liners to people who say stupid stuff online. And it's like you're probably being counterproductive at that point, because what it takes is relationship building and really saying, well, what are you afraid of? Because probably we're afraid of the same stuff. Like, we're all afraid that we're losing ground, that there's a bunch of billionaires who are amassing all the wealth and the rest of us are going downhill, and the planet seems to be tanking and our wages don't go as far as they used to. It's just, how are we going to try to fix that? What do we think the solution is? That's the thing that often is a bit different, to put it mildly. So if you can get people calmed down enough to say, like, hey dude, we're afraid of the same stuff, your fears are valid, but let's talk about how we're actually going to make a difference versus things that might not actually make a difference. That's when you can sort of start, but also just showing people that you value, right? Because a lot of people who get out of these rabbit hole type situations, out of a lot of cult movements or extremist movements, will say it was you know, it wasn't somebody yelling at them on the street or telling them they were wrong or giving them a bunch of facts. They already knew all the facts. It was somebody, you know, often like a romantic partner who treated them like they were worthwhile for the first time in their lives. And suddenly they had something to think about other than politics or religion or whatever was swallowing their entire life at that point, or something to fight for other than this craziness that had kind of consumed them. So, yeah, I mean, working with people, getting them calmed down, pulling them aside individually so that they're not in threatening situations, having to defend themselves. That's where it's gonna start to make a difference. And yeah, like I said, um, spending the time there's no other way around it. Like it's about human connection, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, one thing I've noticed about people who are fully indoctrinated fascist types is they actually have a very accurate initial social assessment. It's almost like they scan the social perimeter, and they have a lot of just accurate understandings of seeing the inequalities and seeing the trouble. But it goes awry pretty much immediately, just with the next step in. And this is not like a full-fledged thought, but one thing that I've noticed a lot about the sort of the indoctrination process is that it actually it's almost like the field itself that you're working in is a white supremacist space, but the indoctrination point almost always starts with misogyny, and it seems to end the further you fall down, it's like, yeah, you start with misogyny, you're in an entire world of white supremacy, and eventually you land on anti-Semitism. And that's not it's not like a precise measuring stick. It's like not 100% accurate across the board. It is just something that I've noticed with the individuals that I have worked with and spoken with, and who have been open with their experiences, that a lot of it seemingly comes from a just disdain towards women, and and it can be self-hatred. A lot of the women involved in these fascist movements are very they are it's very odd. Like somebody like Lauren Southern, for instance, it's like um she technically doesn't align with fascist values, even though she's pushing them. It's like the fact that she has her own show and like does her version of journalism. It's like that's actually against what she's fighting for. Um, I yeah, yeah. I know that's a really incoherent thought that I just said, but it's something I've noticed, and like even the current fascist movement, a lot of them came from the manosphere originally. It was the anti-feminism movement on YouTube. It was the Gamergate phenomenon, and all of this. Um, yeah. I don't know. What do you think about that? Is there any accuracy to that from what you've noticed?
I mean, I think if you have the impulse to really, you know, judge people based on categories, and of course we all do. Again, this is something that our brains love to do, is to categorize things and, you know, put them in neat little boxes. Otherwise we'd never be able to make sense of the world around us, you know. Especially as adults, right? Our brains are great at classifying things. But if you have the impulse to take those classifications um, and rank them, especially to say, you know, whatever category I'm in, that one's the best, and everybody else is less good than I am, then a lot of those things will kind of work together. And you know, if you're better than other people because you're white, you might be, you know, willing to believe that you're better than other people because you're male, better than other people because you're straight, better than other people because of, you know, whatever it is. And then we've got on top of that, of course, like just the weight of, you know, millennia of social baggage along with that. Um, all of these social structures that come along with patriarchy, with misogyny, um, building in these, you know, not valuing women's perspectives as much, not valuing the perspectives of people of color or indigenous people, or in this particular society, not valuing the experiences of people who aren't Christian or aren't the right kind of Christian in a lot of cases. So yeah, if you're into, you know, actually putting stock in the value of those social categorizations and valuing human beings based on their demographic groups, that is something that that often comes, they come together. And I think in particular in this moment, that incel movement is big, that it's still sort of the fall of American manufacturing from its golden age in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And a lot of those jobs have been outsourced. A lot of the like coal production, steel production, that kind of stuff has been sidelined, whether it's because of um, cheap Chinese steel coming in or because coal is a really dirty energy source. And the jobs that are replacing it are ones that are much more open to women, don't require as much of the, you know, the brute strength as a lot of the manufacturing jobs that paid really well did. And so misogyny is sort of, I think, just a knee-jerk reaction to feeling like you're losing your place in society, feeling like as a man you, and I think the statistics actually bear this out, that as a man it is more difficult um, to get ahead. Our boys are not doing as well in school as they used to be. Like education wise, girls have, like, you know, more than caught up, which isn't to say that in the work world they have, but education wise they have. And in rural areas, impoverished areas, that's especially true. So we're really in the midst of a fascinating moment, and I don't think that it'll be over in our lifetimes. We're in the middle of a period when we're moving from these physical manufacturing jobs to, you know, suddenly they can be done by robots. A lot of the work is more intellectual and doesn't depend so much on your body strength, right? And that changes gender dynamics. And that's a process that's going to take a couple hundred years if we don't destroy the planet. So the social ramifications of that, I have no idea how it'll end up at the end, but it is certainly overturning a lot of the traditional power structures. And the impact on real people's lives can be, for some of us, extremely liberating and awesome, but other people will experience that as disempowering, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, didn't even get into, you know, there's like 1,000 things we could have like gone towards, but I did just want to clarify to some people, because I know there can be a knee-jerk impulse to the, is Donald Trump a fascist or not? And I've heard the like, well, he's not like a card-carrying fascist. And to be honest, I don't know if it like really needs an official label to engage in the process mechanism. Um, but if you are people that want some validity, the Robert O. Paxton, who is like the expert in fascism, he studied the Vichy movement more than I think really anybody. He's a political historian and theorist. But he was literally waiting. I mean, he literally wrote. He wrote the Anatomy of Fascism, which I have right up there. Um, but he was not declaring Trump a fascist. He was calling him a far right populist. And then January 6th happened, and he was like, "All right, there's no denying. He's now checked every box that I use for a curriculum, like to decipher if somebody's a fascist. Now he's not a national socialist. He's not a Nazi, which that's a lot of people assume fascism just means one brand of fascism, but he's an authoritarian. He's a capitalist fascist. Even then he's a marketing or advertising oriented fascist, and it's different. It's different than the uniform wearing fascism that we saw in the 30s and 40s. But then the other point that I just wanted to talk about before we play our last song is I've really found one of the most insightful things I learned from a former neo-Nazi through the Life After Hate group, which is a really, really amazing organization. It was started by, they call themselves formers, but people who are involved in this movement, and they do de-radicalization work. But one of the things that got me really interested in what this chapter of the book is going to be about, was I was speaking to somebody about music, and they talked about they're at a point where they feel completely de-radicalized in regards to their belief system and the way they view the world. They literally are like, I am denazified in my entire being. And yet the only area that it seeps in is there will be music that gets stuck in their head that is from their fascist days, and they can't get it out of their head, and they feel shame and guilt because of the feeling of nostalgia that comes out of it, because they do have positive memories for something that they find horrible and disgusting and shameful. And so that is actually like an area of music therapy. I haven't gotten to do enough work in it to really have a concrete understanding of it, but that was just a nugget of information that I found really, really essential on having a better understanding of the phenomenon of fascist music, because you can change your philosophical undertaking, but if a song gets stuck in your head, like, how do you get it out? And yeah.
I mean, I find the same thing. Like, I grew up in a very conservative religious home. I wouldn't say a cult, but I had some relatives who kind of headed that direction. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, I was totally disgusted with all forms of Christian rock music, but a lot of the more sort of classical stuff, Bach, Bach cantatas, or oddly some of the hymn tunes and the bluegrassy stuff. Like, I still listen to it, and there was a long time when I felt weird, and when some of my like atheist friends would say, what is wrong with you? You don't believe this stuff. And I kind of came to terms with it a bit, that like, this is just something that I have an emotional attachment to, and I have an emotional attachment to my family, and it feels like home, and we're just gonna go with it, and play the music and be there at the family holiday things, and like, don't have to panic just because when Bach comes on my MP3 player, I happen to like it, even though it's religious music. Like, it's okay. And I think for a lot of people, yeah, those musical things that don't, or any kinds of artistic things that don't really seem to conform to your politics. Like on the one hand, yes, the personal is political and everything about our personal lives matters for the political world, but also like you don't have to take yourself so seriously all the time. Like not everything in your life is a crisis. And that was kind of my adult realization, was that at least it's not a crisis if I like this song, you know?
Yeah. Well, Kirsten, thank you so much for being a part of this dialogue. Yeah, Lewis, I know we're supposed to do 6:15. We got one more song. But this last song is it's a hymn, actually. Uh it's one for every soul and nation, which was it comes from really great poem by James Russell Lowell called "The Present Crisis," and it was about it was a protest song against the Mexican American War. But in recent years, it has been used as an anti-fascist anthem, specifically against the KKK and more American-oriented experiences. And in fact, Dr. Barry Black used it as the opening prayer at the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. So, you know, there you go. But yeah, that's what this song is. And with that, I'll pass it off to Lewis. Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten.
And thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the invitation.
Talking about the light topic of transgenerational trauma. Think, yeah.
Truth. It is up to you to know the truth. What happens next is all up to you.